Good evening, everyone. My name is Mariko Chang. I'm the Director of Philanthropy at Honolulu Civil Beat. Thank you all for spending your Friday evening with us. This is incredible to see how many people came out to talk about climate change and agriculture. So mahalo to you for all for making it out tonight. This event would not be possible without the partnership with the Hawaiʻi Institute for Sustainable Community Food Systems at the University of Hawaiʻi, West Oʻahu, and the UH Better Tomorrow Speaker Series. Our reporting on agriculture and the environment, as well as community health, is also supported by the Ulupono Fund at the Hawaiʻi Community Foundation, the Healy Foundation, the Marisla Fund at the Hawaiʻi Community Foundation, the Frost Family Foundation, the Cooke Foundation, the Atherton Family Foundation, and Papaʻola Lokahi. Just a couple of housekeeping things tonight. I hope you all had a chance, if you parked in the building, to get your parking validated. Otherwise, please find someone with a Civil Beach shirt, and your validation is good for 2 hours. Bathrooms are out the door and to your right. And now I'll hand the mic over to our moderator, Thomas Heaton, who will introduce tonight's panel.
Aloha kākou. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's proceedings. It's totally impressive, this crowd. Thank you so much for coming along. Tonight is the latest iteration of Transforming Hawaii's Food System Together speaker series. We've so far touched on everything from livestock production to public health and tourism to disaster preparedness. Tonight we're talking about agriculture in the context of climate change. So, of course, I'm Thomas Heaton, a reporter here at Civil Beat, and the lion's share of my work has focused on the Hawaii Grown Project, our agricultural and food systems coverage. And I'm very lucky to be moderating this discussion with Dr. Susan Crowe and Gabe Sachter-Smith. Susan Crowe is a professor of soil ecology and biochemistry at the University of Hawaiʻi and is leading the Hawaii Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities, a $40 million initiative funded by the US Department of Agriculture aimed at integrating sustainable practices into Hawaii's agricultural landscape to align it with the myriad climate change initiatives and goals that Hawaii has in place. We also have Gabe Sachter-Smith, a banana maven here based here on Oʻahu. While many of us might only be familiar with a few different types of bananas, maybe apple, maybe Cavendish if we're lucky, Sachter-Smith has identified some 500 varieties of the fruit the world over. He's also a farmer here on island, one who works alongside scientists to safeguard the genetic diversity of bananas, among many other things, as a way to help future-proof the fruit in the face of climate change and emerging climate disasters and emerging diseases. And just one thing before we start, we will be saving a little bit of time towards the end of the event for your questions. So if you would like to ask a question of our experts here, please do head to that little table over there, the little black table, and write your questions down, and we will try pick the cream of the crop and fit them all in. But with all that said, let's start. So I think we should really start with a bit of a stock take of where we're at, Susan. So I'm just wondering where we are in this kind of climate change discourse and why it is important to be having these discussions here in Hawaii right now.
Mahalo. Always a great question. Aloha, everyone. At this point, there's irrefutable data showing increasing temperatures globally. And so I think that the calls are getting louder and louder every day for a culture shift. That's a shift away from profit and privilege and wealth and towards sustainability and resilience as a basic premise for economic exchange. And so I think we're at the stage here in Hawaii where we're very much ready to lead some of those conversations. There's a growing awareness of a planet in peril and a growing awareness of the societal costs that come with climate change. as well as a growing demand for locally produced sustainable food and other products that very much align with this needed shift and intervention that's required to get us to decarbonization, more sustainable, resilient food systems, and a more aloha aina-based economy here in Hawaii. And so fire and floods have really brought to the forefront of our attention this climate crisis, of course, and also the legacy of abandoned and currently unproductive agricultural lands are fueling invasive species and those fires, as well as eroding and contributing pollution and sedimentation to our nearshore environments, as well as the damage it does along the way. So I think that is where we're at.
Well, I think Susan did a pretty good job of summarizing that. From a producer's perspective, I feel like it can actually be somewhat hard to get a grasp on what climate change really means because, these are long-term global systems, and I'm a young farmer too, so I don't really have the many decades of experience. Also first generation, so not hearing, direct stories of my family farms past. But still, I think that there's definitely a sense that, we should be getting prepared in some ways. But also that if it's another curveball, maybe it's a really large one and a really complicated one. But if there's one thing that farmers are always having to do, it's adapt to the moment, whether it's changing weather or somebody ran over a irrigation riser at the end of the day and you had plans and now you got to fix it. There's always things. So I think adaptability is really where it starts. And, we could probably go back and forth all day about what, we can do about the larger issue as like a nation or global community. But really, at the end of the day, I think it's individual and then community-wide adaptability.
So can you give us some specific examples of how climate change is affecting agriculture in Hawaii and perhaps even on your own farm?
Sure. So I think a lot of the way I look at climate, and I'm not a climatologist, I don't even know if that's the right word, but it's kind of like long-term weather patterns. And we are always having to consider about what weather events we gotta account for. If we had a 50 mile per hour strong sustained wind event once every 10 years, that would still be enough reason to take that into consideration and plan your farm accordingly with windbreaks or other types of strategies. If that became a yearly event, it's still kind of the same practice. But I think it is maybe reminding a lot of us that these practices, maybe we could get by using alternatives or not even doing them. But as the climate is changing and as we see, basically more severe or more frequent bouts of the same stuff we've dealt with, that we really need to take it more seriously. And I think, some of them has become fringe activities in conventional agriculture, like deliberately adding organic matter or, planting plants that you're not going to harvest directly. Maybe those were seen as probably good, but not worth it. And maybe the shift is now more farmers of all types of production systems and philosophies starting to recognize that maybe these are universally useful no matter what you're trying to do.
So, Susan, I'm wondering if you can share with us some of the immediate actions that are needed for both mitigation and for adaptation to the current climate change effects we're experiencing here in Hawaii.
Yeah, the key word there is immediate action, right? There are a lot of options out there that don't require more research and development. We can do them now. And many people have been doing them now. So that's kind of the amazing thing is there's a lot of options out there. And so some of those in the mitigation realm, which is in some ways quite literally pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and getting it sequestered into biomass or below ground or in products even for a very long period of time. That's the really critical component of carbon sequestration is that we pull it from the atmosphere and keep it out of the atmosphere for a long period of time. So you can do that through tree planting, but you can also do that through soil practices that add organic matter, add biochar. That's also a good potential sequestration where carbon comes out and then stays in the ecosystem. You can also have direct emissions avoidance. And so by simply growing and buying locally sourced products, you are actually avoiding emissions as a result of not having to import that. So these are immediate actions that people can take even at the smallest choices and levels to do the mitigation side. The adaptation is much more open, and you can think about it much more holistically. There are a lot of ways to adapt and prepare our producers and practitioners, as well as us as consumers and residents for what is to come. And those can be more holistic aspects of adding organic matter, not for carbon, but for soil health. Building health and resilience and equity into landscapes helps build that into the communities who interact with those landscapes. So those are components of adaptation. Also, reconnecting people with land and land care builds resilience in communities. That's also climate adaptation having to do with actions that we can take now. And then there are greater connections to a circular economy, nutrient recapture, as well as community well-being. There's Indigenous well-being and connection to genealogy. And all of those are together part of how we all can prepare for what's to come, which is a component of climate adaptation.
So you touched on the community side of things, and I think that's obviously a very important part of this conversation. And I'm wondering if you could both kind of tell me who in agriculture, who in the food system is most affected by climate change?
I think anyone that eats.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, the key word there is a system, and it doesn't exist in one place. And especially for food systems, I don't believe that I'm a farmer, so I like farms. I recognize the importance of agriculture, but in my mind, a really robust food system is something that exists beyond just agriculture. It's something interwoven into the environment. And so, one side of it is looking at plants and soil and the ground, but, there's also the health of our fisheries and the health of the forests and the health of cooperation in a community to how you peacefully split up harvest from trees that are on public land. I think they all kind of have a piece of the puzzle. So yeah, who's affected though? Hopefully everybody. I think if you're not affected, you're on your way to Mars or something.
I think as in many patterns kind of globally as well here, the most affected directly impacted by climate change are those least responsible for it. I think that's very much true. And through the partnership and the work of the project, we're really trying to uplift small producers, medium and small scale producers, underserved producers, as well as Indigenous practitioners. Often those folks are among the most affected without having contributed in many ways to the bigger crisis.
So my understanding is within your initiative, you have a full spectrum of different types of growers, small, medium, perhaps on the getting bigger, ranchers, people such as Gabe, growing fruit. Can Could you tell me how those farmers all kind of fall within the work that you're doing, as they may be kind of considered more conventional with their methods and perhaps using using inputs that we don't necessarily equate with good environmental practices, all the way to the other side where, you're doing all the nice organic things and you're certified even, yeah.
Yeah, we kind of only half joke that we made our portfolio like as complicated as possible because Hawaii is a complicated place, right? We have incredible diversity across what is the agricultural sector. So we really wanted to build all of those producers, practitioners. There's a chance for everybody to improve, right? And also people who are already doing great work. And so we really wanted to include all of those practices and all of those producers, as well as the huge diversity in climates and soils that people have to deal with. And so we have a very complex portfolio of specific practices that people can implement. And we have some of our larger scale practices, people are really excited about planting trees, so tree and shrub establishment. Agroforestry is a really, really popular one, kind of in that more forestry sector. Larger scale, so forest products, as well as our ranchers who are interested in incorporating trees, as well as other good management practices. But then we've got lots of interest in folks from the smaller producers really interested in soil organic carbon amendments. So that would be compost and biochar, as well as nutrient management, windbreaks. So lots of the practices that folks are already doing or already have heard about. And there's something in there for everyone, right? And that's part of our purpose, is to build that equity and more just assessment frameworks such that we can recognize people for the good work they're already doing and uplift anybody who wants to implement anything across a very wide range of what is a climate smart practice.
Gabe, can you give us some examples of some of the practices that you might do on your farm that would fall within the climate smart practices realm?
Sure. There's things that we do which are directly being, subsidized or assisted by the program. And then there's things that we're doing anyway that we could, but, you got to kind of pick and choose in a grant. But what we're doing specifically is applying organic matter and planting windbreaks. So those are two things which realistically we would be doing anyway. And so it's nice to have some support to do it. There's some other USDA funded programs in the past. Well, they're still current, but in our past, which we've applied for, specifically through NRCS, and some of them require you to not have the practice in place in order for them to help fund it. But, well, for example, if we wanted to plant windbreaks, we need to have a field of crops that need to be protected from the wind before we can get windbreaks funded. But that's very okay, if you know what you're doing, you don't get any help. If you don't know what you're doing, or you pretend to not know what you're doing, you can get assistance. So what's nice about this is that it recognizes that these are good ideas that you should be doing up front anyway, and really helps to, subsidize it, because, most farmers, especially all the ones that I know, would never argue against the utility of many of these practices, but we could argue all day about the, feasibility of implementing them with costs and labor and time and resources. So, that always has to be part of the equation. And so a program like this really does help, because it takes things that you would want to be doing anyway that you might, not be able to do on your own or as quickly, and just helps give a little boost to make sure that they get done. So in our case, it's specifically windbreaks and adding organic matter. Some other practices that we do that aren't specifically part of this grant, but could be potentially, would be cover cropping, planting, I guess like agroforestry in a way. I have some like small scale agroforest systems. And I'm sure there's others, but those are the ones that come to mind.
Great. So there's been global recognition of the virtues and reality that Indigenous agricultural practices are generally more climate sensitive and productive nonetheless. Here in Hawaii, we're no different. We have the watershed system, Maukata Makai, Ahupua'a system, that's been identified as holistic, incredibly climate sensitive, and I'm just wondering, you know, when it comes to the work that falls under this program and this technological push forward and looking at technology as a means to help with climate change and adapting to climate change, how are you kind of bringing those two worlds together in a place like Hawaii where the Ahupua'a system is just so important?
Great question. Thanks. Yeah, this project has an enormous opportunity to really do the deep and hard work that is required to enter into a space where we hope to have interwoven knowledge systems, which is required to do place-based equity here in Hawaii. Indigeneity is part of that. And so Indigenous innovation, we hope, will very much be a foundation, basically the infrastructure of this moving forward. I love how that concept is starting to come out as infrastructure, but entering into that work is something that we do carefully and very intentionally, and it takes time, right? But in terms of some of the early Indigenous practices of interest that really encapsulate that Maukata Makai concept, we have a huge interest in agroforestry and forest farming, which agroforestry can be done in Hawaii. That doesn't make it Hawaiian. And biocultural restoration, though, is one component of that. So that's entered into very carefully what that looks like and how we can incorporate that. There's been some incredible work done on suitability of landscapes, including projections for future climates, such that if that work is undertaken, it will be something that persists and is there for future generations. That's one example more, Mauka. And then the dryland or upland kalo is something that's really come to mind with this question, because there's not a lot of it right now, but it's something that historically was really, really critical, especially in sort of the mid-range of the Maukata Makai. And some of our partners, Noeau Prato at Hui Mau, are undertaking the practice of pa kukui, where you dig the lua or pit and fill with compost kukui. And that can actually be reflected in some of our more modern constructs of composting and nutrient management. And so applying some of our current assessment techniques to look at soil health and nutrient management can really help them better understand how that works so that they can reconnect with that genealogical practice of place. And that's a really, really exciting one that we're working closely with them. And then, of course, closer to the shoreline are Lo'i Kalo and the incredible innovation that was here in Hawaii with those irrigated systems, and talking to folks and seeing how they're pulling in current concepts of water conservation and technology to help really with the water management in those systems, but really centering those lo'i kalo as those the multidimensionality of what is climate smart, that connection to community and well-being, economic well-being, as well as just wellness and Indigenous well-being and genealogy. And so putting into place metrics that we would call success in implementing climate smart that are tied to those practices is absolutely central to what we aim to do over the coming years.
I just saw Jim Wyben earlier, and he's a bit of a gem in the aquaculture scene. So just seeing and made me think. With your kind of focus on Indigenous methods of agricultural production and land management, does aquaculture fall into that at all?
That's a good question, and it's not currently part of our portfolio, but we are entering into a second phase of our partnership when we call it phase 2, where we are very much looking for outreach into the community, and there will be a whole kind of roadshow that we do and open up an opportunity for folks to apply for this second round of funding, and that would be a great place to pull in some of the aquaculture.
Cool. And sorry, just quickly on outreach, guys, please feel free to fill out the flashcards if you have further questions. I'll be sure to try and ask them at the end. So thank you so much. I'm wondering, Gabe, you touched on this earlier. There are countless hurdles for farmers in Hawaii, and just as many barriers. How do you think producers will really be able to implement these practices kind of going forward? How do you think they can be convinced, because as you said, you're a young farmer, we've got an aging workforce in the farm, in the agricultural sphere. What do you think it'll really take to convince them to, perhaps move on towards the climate smart agricultural practices?
Yeah, that's a tough one because, as much as we can imagine the benefit, unless we really see it, it's hard to justify implementing it. For me personally, I feel like I've had, really amazing opportunities to travel the world and travel the Pacific studying bananas, but I'm looking at other stuff. I'm looking at normal or non-banana production systems and thinking about things. But then back on the farm, I find myself, if I travel, I get really inspired. And I come back and I'm like, all right, I want to try this, want to try that, and eventually fall back into all right, well, here's what I have to do to just, pay our bills for the next month. So it can be really challenging. And I think that's where USDA or other type of, larger governmental institutional funding can really help because, even if you think, it's a pretty good idea, but I can't afford it, okay, well, can we help you pay for it? I think that's one element of it. The other is, unfortunately, you really learn a lot. Well, it's not unfortunate. You learn a lot when things go wrong, and it can only take one bad weather event or, a bad winter or something, or a bad summer, depending on what you're thinking about, for you to really think man, I wish I could have done something about that. So I guess really it's just making it easy. Making it an easy choice is probably the most important thing because we have a lot of hard decisions that we got to make and a lot of hard work. So if it's an easy choice, then I think we'll do it, If there's too many barriers, sorry. And a lot of grants I've turned down, more and more because I'm it's not worth it. I'd rather do that practice on my own scale, on my own time, rather than have it be held over my head now you have to do it or you have to report it in a certain way and all the bureaucratic, back and forth, which is something that in this grant, I know Susan and other folks that are working on the administration level really have taken the brunt of it, which is super nice from a production standpoint because like I said, I turn down a lot of grants these days because I just don't have the time or energy to do the administration and the management of them. So at least in my experience, a lot of that's been offloaded, which has been really, really helpful.
That's good to hear because it was a lot of work.
Yeah.
And we're willing to do it, but it's really eye-opening. I mean, this program was supposed to be low barriers and addressing barriers. And then we've experienced firsthand some of these institutional federal level barriers. And it's been really eye-opening to understand where that hesitancy comes from. And we had an amazing student, Destiny Apilado, in our program at the university, and she investigated the nature of some of these barriers, particularly that small producers and underserved producers face when accessing these funds that are available. I mean, over the last couple of years, there's been enormous opportunity, and it's heartbreaking to know that someone even like Gabe, would turn an opportunity down. But she found just shocking, complex barriers at every step of the way. So right from just knowing what opportunities there even are to deciding, do I even want to enter into this process? Then the application and the proposal, then managing the grant itself, right? So even that is difficult. So all the way, there are barriers at every step, even to you have the money in hand and now you have a bad winter or a storm comes through or a flood comes through and you can't implement what you. So it was really eye-opening to understand simply the barriers that are experienced every day by producers who want to implement these practices and ultimately might not, even though the money is there. So the desire is there and the money is there. And that's not even touching on issues of land access, land availability costs, right? Those are a whole other category that also are inclusive of barriers to implementing these practices because of eligibility issues, right? So yeah, it's incredible what folks face. And so, yeah, we're trying to address that on the project by providing direct incentive payments and doing the paperwork the best we can. Also making investment payments to help provide some of those upfront costs, particularly useful when somebody wants to compost or do that nutrient recapture, pyrolysis. And we're also providing on-farm technical assistance. We have an incredible team of climate smart specialists who go on farm and work directly with our producers and practitioners, as well as just investing in kind of workforce and development investment in our community-based groups who are already trusted partners with our producers. And so those are the things that the project and the partnership can provide directly to help overcome some of those many barriers.
If only there were more hours in the day, of course. I really do wonder, something you mentioned a little bit earlier, Susan, was, you want to measure the success of the program. How exactly do you do that? How exactly can one measure how well the program is, how well farmers are doing in implementing these processes, and what the payoff is?
Measuring the right thing is really critical, right? And so because we have our funding from the USDA, of course, they're defining success for us, and we have to report. So those are some of the metrics of success, but we argue very strongly that our internal metrics of success are more important for us. And so we've invested equally, if not even more, in trying to establish our own metrics for how we are defining climate smart. So I mentioned earlier, one of the greatest opportunities really for innovation kind of with the university side of what we're doing is this opportunity to define what is climate smart. And that's computational backing so that there's rigor to support what our metrics are, but they are place-based and local. And so that's a multi-dimensional metric that we're considering that is consistent with circular economy and these new economic frameworks, and that will have the rigor and scientific data backing that is required for defending, these practices and success. But they're based in that range of metrics that are inclusive of community and Indigenous well-being, soil health and resilience, human nutrition. I forgot that one before. We have metrics of human nutrition, which can really value our local crops, local variety of crops, and agroforestry. These are things that are often left out of these assessment frameworks and therefore are not valued, which is that ends here. That ends with us, right? So we're undertaking that work. And so I don't know yet is the answer, because we're doing that work together with community, with Indigenous practitioners to ensure that those metrics that come together to indicate success in climate smart are meaningful and appropriate. But that's the approach we're taking for internal metrics of success. And so that ties to equity and distribution of resources. We'll track those. USDA doesn't so much care, but we do. And so that's really important to us. And so with that metric that is backed by data collected in this way that is co-developed, we can then use that metric successfully to stand up backing for the emerging market, which is another one of our requirements of the project. So we're on a funding period. We want Gabe and everyone to continue producing in perpetuity, right? And so one of the things we're trying to do is establish that rigorous backing with metrics of success that are meaningful here in Hawaiʻi, so that it lives far beyond the end of our granting period.
Great, thank you. I think we have to move to audience questions, but I'm just going to ask one really, really quick question to you both. That is, how can Hawaii support its farmers and its food producers to implement these practices to make it a reality across the board? And yeah, that's my final question before I get to you guys.
Well, I think the most straightforward we probably all know, like buy local. If we're not in business, we're not going to be farming. And it really does make a difference if somebody, I mean, I have to have the conversation many times where it's like, why should I buy your bananas? I can go get them at Costco for cheaper. It's like, well, go do that. But, you know, don't think that you're helping local farmers by doing that. And, you know, some businesses like maybe ride the edge where like, we'll get some local stuff and maybe some not. And I get it, you know, from a business owner myself, like we always have to make those hard economic decisions. But another thing that I think a lot about is that growing food in Hawaiʻi is really easy, like to be honest. If our only goal was try to like feed humans things that are edible and can keep a human alive, like just grow those things, it's pretty easy. The hard part is growing things that people want to buy, that you can actually make a profit off of, to have a business, to pay for the land, to pay people to help you, to pay for inputs. That gets really complicated. So if the only goal was just growing food, it's super easy. And I think that we have, you know, it's a challenge and an opportunity specifically in, you know, literally what foods we're eating. We could build the most resilient, like thought out, scientifically tested and prescribed systems for, you know, making sure that we can grow like lettuce and carrots throughout any climate, you know, change events. And they're still going to be way less adapted than tropical crops that are kind of used to this weather and climate. And I think that personally, I grow bananas, not for this reason, but I've always thought it's a bit fortunate that, in my opinion and perspective, we essentially, Hawaiʻi, kind of the default diet is still essentially this Western-based diet artificially imposed on a tropical location. And we're asking farmers to grow these things that really don't match the climate very well. Bananas are funny in that they're a tropical crop artificially imposed on the Western diet, reimposed on a tropical location. So people actually really want them, and they're kind of easy to grow, relatively speaking. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for that, though. You know, like I have a lot of vegetable grower friends, and when we get, 10-inch downpours in the winter, I feel them. I used to be a vegetable grower too, and it's like, yeah, your lettuce and bok choy is done. Your carrots exploded. Your tomatoes are trash, and my bananas are loving it. And like, it couldn't be better. But I think that there is, kind of going back to like, what does it mean to rely on or seek inspiration from indigenous cropping practices. I think you really have to look at it for what it is, and it's, the plants that are grown are the ones that work. And it doesn't mean there aren't ones that you can do in addition, and it doesn't mean, banish all lettuce and kale from being planted. But I think if we're talking about the base of the diet, it really, like, that shift is something that is a huge opportunity. And I think, if there were a really big disaster, right, and we can't bring in certain things anymore, you'd find out pretty quickly what's edible and what works. And that's essentially what Pacific Island traditional diets are, like, already. So you kind of gotta, I think that's a big missed opportunity, or not missed opportunity, I don't know what you call it. Something we're not doing that we could be doing better.
Do you know that even I can grow bananas?
Me too.
They're not that hard.
Do you know that I have your bananas growing in my yard?
I didn't.
I know. You gifted a couple of pups to, whoops. You gifted a couple of pups to Jonathan Dienick, probably 12, 13, 14, 15.
Sounds about right.
And then he gifted some to me.
Yeah,
so I have
see?
some of Gabe's
They're not that hard.
banana descendants growing in my yard. It's a humbling experience to grow anything but the bananas I can do.
Amazing. That's so great. I have a dead banana tree in my yard, so one's alive. So we have time for a couple of questions. Thank you, guys. These are really, I just had to flip through the amazing questions, but I'm going to first off start with one for Dr. Crow. This is an interesting one. Is there sufficient biochar infrastructure to support the demand for climate smart practices in Hawaii? Second part of the question, and how does the biochar infrastructure vary from island to island?
Good. I love biochar right now. It comes and goes over the years, but I'm back on biochar because you're laughing. Really like biochar right now because there's an opportunity to distribute the infrastructure across the islands, which I think is a very good idea. We thought that was a great idea a while ago, and then it kind of went out, and now it's back in. So that more distributed infrastructure for something like biochar, I think, is critical. And right now there is virtually no infrastructure for it, to my knowledge. People are cooking it up, very small scale, which is amazing, and using it for kind of their own personal use on farm, and that's amazing. We have a couple of producers who are doing that. I particularly like it when we manage to take a waste stream. Chicken manure, for example, to biochar is amazing. That's a fantastic, and that I know at least is happening here on Oʻahu. But over on the Big Island, removing woody invasive species, and then rather than chopping it up and decomposing it, sending it right back to the atmosphere, you send it through pyrolysis, and it's in biochar. It doesn't stay forever, but it stays a lot longer. So this is very good for actual warming mitigation. I love it, actually. It's one of my favorites. We're doing some math to really convince people. But man, I'm hoping once we do that math, we can get much more distributed infrastructure for pyrolysis, because the feedstock matters, and then how it interacts with the soil matters, and all of those are different across all of the different islands. And so investing in those smaller, what might be considered a pilot scale, but actually is a perfect scale for us, in many different locations all around the islands, I think is the way to go for biochar. I think I got both parts of that question.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
That's great. And of course, sorry, I'm going to add my own little question in here is when we talk about invasive species, of course, we've got albesias galore, we've got all the trees, they can all kind of feed into that infrastructure potentially?
They can. So back to our friends on the Hamakua Coast, Huimau, are doing incredible work clearing very large areas of invasive, non-native trees, very big tree. These are big trees, right? Clearing them, and what they've been doing is chipping. And you can chip and have it as mulch on site. That's actually also a climate smart practice. But even better, you can convert it to biochar. And so we've actually done some of the computations with them to see what that scaling would look like for that level of commitment. About 1,000 acres is what they hold. How much material they have to clear, what it would take to chip it, and then instead of leaving it to decompose or shipping it somewhere else, do that more localized pyrolysis on site. So they're very interested in that. They've been doing it much smaller scale, just kind of proof of concept with emu style, kind of just small scale, making biochar, and then incorporating it into some of our ongoing trials with them to see if it helps with the pakukui cropping system actually practice. So yeah, it can work. And yes, woody debris can go in to it, no problem. Another real opportunity is wastewater treatment. That gets a little bit trickier because then you've got municipal waste. But man, if we can tear down some of those barriers and understand how to care for the contaminants that might be there, that's another really promising option. So yeah, if you can cut it, clear it, chip it into a size, or you can stick it into one of these units, you can make biochar with it.
Great. Potential win to the power of infinity. Sounds like. So I have a question here for you, Gabe. How is crop breeding a part of building resilience, climate resilience for you, and how does that kind of come to be? Can you just explain a little bit about that?
So breeding plants is something that I have a particular interest in. And I think that there's a few ways of looking at it. One is that a lot of the varieties that you can get now, I was just kind of trash talking vegetables a minute ago, but say you go to a standard vegetable seed catalog and you look for any variety that could be, having some type of, it's ready for the farm, not just a curiosity for the backyard. A lot of them have been selected and created with the intention of them growing in conventional systems, as opposed to, say, organic systems or systems that might be a little bit more climate smart. And there is some different initiatives around through like Organic Seed Alliance. They're an NGO that's been involved with a lot, and there's some different efforts between different public institutions that still have crop breeding programs left. But essentially, it's something that's pretty major. Like, variety really counts. It's not enough just to say, we can grow bananas. It's like, well, which banana? And like, which one is better? And I think part of it, though, isn't necessarily going backwards. Like, I think there is a place for like heirlooms or these old school varieties. But at the same time, there is knowledge in the fact that they're not grown on a large scale anymore, many of them, and it's not because they were super awesome and productive and withstood the test of time. So I think breeding is important, but breeding with the intention in mind that, like, what system are these going to be in? Are they going to be able to, if we're trying to, for example, have more soil cover and have more living plants in the ground, then like you need to have plants that are really, competitive and have that early vigor to outcompete weeds instead of having to kill every weed. Maybe you can leave the weeds, but your crop still does okay. So there's definitely a huge opportunity, and it's really important. And I think also, kind of like I was saying before, with what plants we're even talking about in the first place, it kind of is, I think, part of it where, do we breed a better, more resilient tropical lettuce? Or do you like get to know one of the endless thousands of tropical leafy greens that are perfectly happy growing here? And I think they both kind of play like, okay, maybe we do need some better tropical lettuce for, to get people on board. keep growers in business and then also, promote more of these other crops.
Just, the interesting thought, kind of the colonized diet comes to mind pretty heavily there. So I recognize that we don't have a ton of time, so I'm just going to bounce on to the next question. Sorry, guys. So what is the number one thing that our state government can do? I believe our Deputy Head of Department of Agriculture is here. Hello, Dexter Kashida. Thank you very much for coming. What is the number one thing that our state government can do to help strengthen Hawaii's agricultural sector, knowing that the government can't do everything?
Well, maybe I'll take this from a producer's perspective. There's a few things that have happened and a few things that I wish would happen. One is, it wasn't state level, but the city and county had these ag grants, which was basically just no strings attached cash. There was some vetting, but I think it definitely, it went straight to the point of like tearing down a lot of the barriers and a lot of these reasons why we don't, want to pursue grants. And this was just like, here's money, we trust you, go do with it. And I can't speak for everybody, but I know we put it to really good use and it really helped us out. The other thing would be land access. Susan and had touched on the concept of agroforestry earlier, and it's something that I have been asked a lot about and think a lot about is like, why not more agroforestry? There's all these benefits, there's all this, it's great, but the reality is I don't have the type of land access to even make that remotely economically a good idea. And I know a lot of farmers don't. The return on investment of some of these systems, and you're talking decades, like maybe 30 years before they'll be like, economically viable and stable. And if you're on a month-to-month rental agreement that you don't know how long you're going to keep it, like there's no incentive, there's no ability to do that. So I'm kind of hoping that through like ADC and, other, maybe through the ag parks too, that there's just more, not just land access, but access that allows farmers to really root into a place and to think long-term and to plan long-term, because not all land access is equal. But if we're talking like we want farmers to be long-term stewards of your site and of the soil and to be thinking long-term, then we need to have access to long-term tenure. Otherwise, it's not going to happen because we're not making money doing it. So we at least need the promise that we can try it out.
I have lots of ideas for the state since Dexter's here.
Sorry, Dexter.
You're trapped. No, we do have lots of ideas for policy. It was actually one of kind of the origins of the partnership and how we were able to compellingly bring so much here to Hawaii. Was our connection to state level work. So as a researcher, I didn't used to think about state stuff and policy, but I knew that to really have impact here, the state policy and policy levers were going to be really important. And I wanted to make sure the research that we were doing on campus was going to feed into those programs that already exist. So piggybacking on current programs would be amazing. So, climate smart is really the hypothesis, the thesis is that ultimately when we build this metric, it can back an emergent market, and climate smart is going to be something that is locally produced with some reasonable, sustainable practices implemented, right? So really starting to see that these, grow locally in Hawaii for Hawaii, keep it here, anything that facilitates not having to import or send cattle, to the mainland and then back, right? All of that nutrient recapture, the circular economy. So we're trying to build out this metric as something that's defensible and rigorous for state to embed in policy to back the market. So that's a major thing, but we actually already have legislation in place that supports a pilot program for incentive for these practices. So there's something that's already existing. I would love to see that become a permanent program, for example. Then there's other just like low-hanging fruits. I mean, compost, come on, let's get some more composting facilities going, right? Like, let's just get that done. Pyrolysis is the same thing. Like that, we're just throwing nutrients away. They become pollutants. They become greenhouse gases. That's crazy. We should be recapturing all of that. That can really be grounded readily in state programs. And then little things like, I think Gabe had mentioned it at one point to me and other producers. The federal programs will pay for a lot, but the federal programs are still struggling to see these as climate smart systems. And we understand systems and agricultural systems here much more clearly. And so the state could intervene and provide these kind of low strings attached. Like if you're participating in this bigger program, but the feds won't pay for this because it makes you ineligible or it's not an eligible practice. But as part of that holistic system, it will really nail down an incredible example of circular economy and amazing climate impact, even for us here in a small place. Right, then that's where the state has the opportunity to be like, I'll buy you that compost spreader. I'll pay for you to do this land prep, even though the feds say it's not climate smart. But we know it's part of a climate smart system. That's where the state can come in and just be like, yep, I'll pay for that. I'll pay for that. And then that makes you eligible and accessible for the bigger part that can come from the feds. Okay, I'll stop there. But I have more ideas. That's okay. Those are my biggies.
That's fantastic. Thank you. A lot of food for thought. Sorry, that was bad. So what are some ways that we as consumers can really support local producers to do this work? Not only, I asked before how we can support, climate-friendly farmers, that kind of thing, but how can the consumers, how can the market really support farmers to even entertain transitioning, going from more conventional methods of using herbicides or pesticides and that kind of thing? How can the market really support that shift away to using these kind of climate-smart methodologies and sustainable practices?
I mean, everyone's looking for the easy way, right? And one thing, like our farm's certified organic, which even if we weren't, we'd probably be doing really similar practices, maybe just with less scrutiny. But, yeah, like organic does mean something. It's not perfect. But a lot of the intention of the national USDA organic program is about building healthy soil. And there's even some really good practices that like you'd want to do, but they're like, no, you can't do it because you could do it better if you did this other way, but it would be helping your soil more if you did it this other way. And so that's one thing. And then the other thing, it's not really, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before, but in a different way, that I think we always try to shove the food system through agriculture. And I think that is super important, but really like also taking the burden off of just farms as they exist now would also be helpful, right? In sort of a bigger holistic way. And that could look like, if you have like a backyard, like grow something. If there's, community programs like school garden programs, getting kids interested early, that really does help. And I think having, our consumers be more food system literate in its broadest sense is really what's going to take, because even if we have the most perfect climate resilient farms, like I still personally believe that it's not just about building out the farms. And if the end goal is building a resilient food system, it takes everybody. And I think in, a lot of agrarian societies in the past, it's something like 80% of the population is typically involved in agriculture. And those were like stable, functional systems. And now we're down to like closer to 1%. And so it's really hard to ask farmers to keep doing, we want more abundant food, more consistent food, cheaper food, healthier, safer, more climate smart, and still you're not going to get any more help. And it's getting worse and worse every year. And I think at some point it's like, you can do anything if you have enough people. You can replace all of these practices just with people. But I think people is one of the biggest missing ingredients, and just getting involved and engaged at whatever level you can is super helpful.
yeah, getting people to change is hard.
Super hard.
Yeah. Another dimension or another avenue that we're taking to try to help this is just to get climate smart, healthy local food more normalized via institutional purchasing. So large buyers, right, will be one mechanism to get some of this food onto plates. And so we have the opportunity to work with many local institutional purchasers, buyers, through this partnership, and some of those avenues that are really important to us are things like working with the schools, Department of Education as an institutional buyer, banks, local businesses, right? The Hawaiʻi Food Bank even can be considered an institutional buyer, and that will guarantee that this food ends up on Hawaii's plates with people who need it the most. And the more we can reconnect keiki and families and community with food like this, grown locally, sourced locally, nutritious and healthy, coming to them via these routes at school and then school gardens and all of that, then maybe over time we can start shifting people's preferences and choices. Otherwise, we're stuck with fancy marketing, social marketing. We can do it. We'll do that too. We're going to do everything. We're going to do everything and try and get people to eat, but it's hard.
But it sounds like there's hope.
There's hope. There's always hope.
And practical steps being taken. So I think on that note, we're going to wrap up. But this has been incredible. Thank you so much to the both of you for sharing your expertise and coming. I think we've all got a lot to think about over the weekend, perhaps at the farmers market. But before I let you all go, I just want to say a big thank you on behalf of Civil Beat, and of course you guys. I'd like to say thank you to Go Farm Hawaiʻi, Hawaii Food Plus Policy, and the delicious Ulu and Kalo Bakery. Thank you guys for being here. You really made our event, and it's been great to have you all. Thank you so much for coming and showing interest in the food system.